Hello audience. You've probably seen this car in the background of several videos. It's the only car I own that has never had any video dedicated directly to it, which is kind of strange because I've owned this car longer than all the others. And people ask about it and I keep saying, yeah, one day I'm going to drag it out and show it to everyone. Well, I'm finally going to do it now. So this is a 1965 Chevrolet Impala Convertible that I bought back in 2015 as a pretty rough project car and completely restored it. Now, I didn't have my channel back then, and I really wish I did because this was quite a bizarre adventure, getting this car and getting it to the condition it is now. I haven't made any videos on this because for the past couple of years I haven't really done anything with it. In fact, most of last year it's just sat here doing nothing. Now, why that is, I'll talk more about that later. Well, like I said, I bought this back in 2015, and when I got it, it was a body shell and most of a chassis. It was missing a lot of parts. I think it's been parted out a few times and pieced together and kind of mocked up, because every part you could easily unbolt was gone, or off another car and just kind of hanging there. It had no interior, no seats, no armrests, none of that. It had no engine or running gear. Most of what bolts to the firewall or the radiator support was gone. It was missing quite a few parts. Most of the trim was either completely destroyed or missing. In spite of all that, it did have some good points. The body is an original convertible, and it did have the original frame on it. The body and the frame have no collision damage, at least none that I could find. The body had a little bit of rust damage. The floor pans were rusted out in the typical places, and the quarter panels were starting to rust through. But for a convertible from the 60s, that's practically rust-free. It is pretty unusual to find them that clean, even in Southern California. And it did have a few valuable parts still on it. Like, it still had the windshield moldings, which are convertible only. The moldings that go around the body. It had the original top frame, and a few other things. As usual with cars that I own, the history of it before me is pretty much unknown. And we know from the firewall tag this car was built at the Van Nuys assembly plant, just outside LA. It was built in February of 1965. It was originally a base model. It was ermine white with a blue interior. It probably had some kind of small block, either a 283 or 327 with a power glide. Now, like I said, when I got it, it was just a body shell. Now, doing some archaeological digging, the first thing we found was lots and lots of chicken feathers inside here. Now, the previous owner was raising chickens, so that explains that. After we dug a lot of that out, we found a lot of abandoned wasp nests everywhere. The rockers and the air vents inside the cowl were all full of sand. And I think somebody was using this for a dumpster at one time because it had a lot of trash in it. Nothing like the Falcon. We didn't find any vintage candy wrappers or business cards or anything like that, just garbage. So, honestly, I'm not sure I even want to know the history of this car. Now, sometime during all that, somebody actually tried to restore this car because some of the rust had already been repaired. Most of the repairs are really bad and I had to redo them, but the point is the effort was there. And I'm guessing the same person tried to convert this to an SS because it had SS front fenders, it had an SS steering column, it had a big massive hole cut in the floor roughly where the shifter would be, and extra holes for bucket seats. I have no idea how far along they got with that, but I assume they made it into a running car and then somebody somewhere else parted it out again. Now, for 1965, I actually like the base model better than the SS, but it was going to cost about the same to piece it together either way, and somebody already started converting it to an SS, so I kind of decided it was a simpler thing to just finish the conversion, and that's the way you see it now. Now, the first thing everyone notices about this car and comments on is the paint color. This is artesian turquoise, which was only used in 1965. Now, when I was getting this painted, at the time, I just didn't think that these cars looked good in solid colors, and to me, white was probably the last choice. I wanted a color with a little more excitement to it. I don't really think that way anymore. I think these look good in all colors, and if I were restoring it today, it would be the original ermine white. I chose to go with artesian turquoise, and that's what you see here now. Now, this is supposed to be mixed to the original factory color. Now, I don't know what's going on with this paint, but I've seen original cars with this color on them, and they don't look like this. Now, the toners are right, it's the right shade, but originally it just looked like metallic turquoise. This has like pearl or something in it, because when the light hits it, it has this strange effect to it. And at first it looks really neat. In fact, I absolutely loved it when we just finished painting it, but after a few years of driving it, it's kind of embarrassing to me now. I mean, it's like driving a massive neon sign. Everyone notices you, it's the center of attention wherever it is. In fact, I generally keep a layer of dust on this car because it tones it down a little bit. But I said I wanted to color with more excitement, and I got exactly that. Because the trim was in really bad shape or just missing, most everything I bought new reproduction, including the bumper, the grille, the headlight bezels, the badging, the wheel opening moldings, the rear bumper, the cove moldings, the taillights, among other things, which was pretty expensive, but it all looks like new. The top is a ready-made kit that I installed, and if you know me, you know I don't really care much for ready-made kits, and this is a good example of why. Now, the edge of the top is supposed to be quite a ways below the top frame. As you can see, it's the opposite, it's quite far above it. Up here on the front, it's about how it should be, and all the way at the back it kind of is too, but everywhere else it's just too short. And this is not just me being picky. There's these seams here that are now exposed to the weather that conventionally wouldn't be. Also, the top is a little too tight around here, so it's drooping way down right here. Even though it has a top pad underneath it, it's not really doing anything. The rear window looks like it's sagging really bad. It's actually pulled really tight. The problem is the rear curtain nails down along the side, and it was too short, so I had to stretch it really hard to get it across here, and that is pulling the rear window down, and that's why it looks like that. Also inside here, there's this flap that's supposed to attach to this top iron, but it's in the wrong location. The top frame is original to the car. Now, it was all complete when I got it. The biggest problem was some of these hinge points, like here and over there, were bent really bad, and some were actually ripped completely out. Now, why that happened, I have no idea, and again, I'm not sure I want to know why, but I took this completely apart and straightened everything out and welded it together, and I did get it working again. I had to replace the motor. It still has the original hydraulic cylinders, and surprisingly, they still work. The interior is white aqua, which is what it would have been with this color. Now, I ordered a ready-made kit and installed this, reason being, this is the 60s, we're getting into the age of molded plastic, and all these seat designs, you can't really do them on a sewing machine. The only way to do them is on the machine like they used originally, if you want the original finish. But I will say, the complete kit was a lot cheaper than I thought it would be, and it fits pretty good all around. Everything looks pretty good. The front seats are actually 64 or earlier ones, just because those are the first ones I found that were affordable and the trim was still good on them. But the main difference that you can tell is they fold at an angle, and 65 they just fold straight forward. I keep saying I'm going to rebuild these sometime and make them like the real 65s. I don't know why, but it bothers me. I don't know if I ever will, though. The back seat is unique to the convertible and was completely missing. This is the back seat out of a 67 full-size Buick 4-door sedan that I got out of a junkyard and just narrowed it and remade the backrest to hold the rear speaker, and it works. The rear armrests are also missing and also unique to the convertible. At the time, these were not available new, so I just made new ones. It's a flat piece of metal that goes around here, a flat piece that goes across here, and this part. So it was probably one of the easiest metal fabrications I've done. It's supposed to have stainless steel trim on here that I never got around to installing. Also, I never cut the hole in it for the ashtray, but it looks pretty good anyway. The windshield moldings, at least for the outside, were still there. The inner ones were missing, and this is something I'm especially proud of. I made all of them new, sort of. Now, the rearview mirror bracket and the top strikers, those are available new, so I just bought those. The moldings that go across the top, I made those out of 22 gauge steel. The ones that go on the sides are kind of tricky. Now, pretty much from here down, they're the same as a sport coupe or a sedan. And here's an original off one of those. The top of it is different, the rest of it is about the same. And these are anodized aluminum. The original convertible ones were steel. Now, the full-size Buick made it this time, also the same car I pirated the back seat from, it had these moldings, but they were made of steel. So I took those, cut the tops of them off, and made the rest of it new out of steel and welded it together. And that's what we see here. Now, most of the ones I've seen are two-piece. They overlap here, but some of them are one piece like this. I made it this way because it was easier. The dashboard is actually mostly out of original parts, although it's pieced together. The moldings are new, but the rest of it is pretty much original. This is one thing I don't really care for with the SS. With the base model, with this gauge, the entire upper half was the fuel gauge. It was a lot bigger and easier to read. For the SS, they shrunk it way down so they could fit 3 other gauges in here. But it still works. As usual with cars from this time, the gauges range from low to high, cold to hot, charge to discharge. The speedometer, I don't know if it's the original to the car, but I actually hand painted the face on it because it was almost entirely burned off, probably from the sunlight. I have an original AM radio for it that I removed to work on something a while ago that never worked. So I added this aftermarket CD player, and I made this bracket that bolts under the dash for it. And we've got aftermarket gauges underneath it, because the coolant temp gauge doesn't work, so I added one here. But if all you have is an aftermarket temp gauge, that implies the car overheats a lot, so I added an oil pressure gauge next to it, just so it looks like we added extra gauges for the fun of it. The gauge on the right side was either a vacuum gauge or a tachometer. This was a vacuum gauge that was in really bad shape and didn't work, so I put an electric tachometer drive behind it and repainted the face and made it a tachometer. Original tachometers for these cars are pretty difficult to find, and working ones are even more difficult to find. This isn't entirely authentic. On the original tachometers, the needle pivots from the bottom of the gauge. On this one, it pivots from the center, and the letters look kind of funny because they're hand painted. But from a distance, if you don't really know those differences, it kind of looks like it belongs. That's good enough for me. Probably the first thing you notice when sitting in this car is just how wide it is. Now the 64 and earlier models are about as wide as a normal modern car today. With these, they made them considerably wider. And you really have to reach out to get to the armrest or the top of the door. And on the other hand, I'm never hitting the window crank with my knee like I am on pretty much every other car. Also, the floor is really wide, so they space the pedals really far apart. So it's easy to put my feet under the pedals and stretch my legs while driving. There's also plenty of space between the driver and passenger. I don't have to share the same arm space here. The extra width does make it more difficult to drive in the crowded cities, but you get used to it. Now, like I said, when I bought this car, it had no engine or transmission in it, which didn't really bother me because at the time I had a 350 small block and a Saginaw 4-speed transmission. In fact, that was kind of the reason I bought this in the first place, was I was looking for a car to use all that in. The 350 was from a Corvette L82. It had a forged crankshaft, 4-bolt mains, it had 202 intake valves, it had guide plates, it had screw-in studs, all the great stuff. One of the best small blocks ever. So I completely rebuilt that. Not a low budget overhaul like what I did with the 3800. Actually got all the machine surfaces redone. I got new parts for everything. Put it together, and that engine was pretty much just a problem from the beginning. It had several problems that didn't really make sense and no one could figure out. It had a few lazy cylinders that kind of worked some of the time, kind of didn't. It burned a lot of oil. It never wanted to idle when it was cold or when it was hot, but the biggest problem it had was it ran hot quite a bit. It really wanted to overheat. Now, this wasn't an old block that was clogged with rust. It was pretty clean when I started with it, and it had been hot tanked. It had a new water pump on it. We tried installing a thermostat. That didn't help. We drilled holes in the thermostat. That didn't help. Drilled more holes in the thermostat. That didn't help. Installed a fan with a hydraulic clutch. That didn't help. Used an electric fan. That didn't help. I bought a big 4-row big block radiator for it, and that didn't help either. But as long as the outside temperature was pretty low and we weren't sitting in any standstill traffic, it stayed cool enough to actually drive it, so I made do with it and used that engine for several years. There's a whole nother bizarre interesting story just about that engine that I might talk about in another video, but long story short, it eventually overheated and seized and cracked both heads. I did get it running again, but then it had a few dead cylinders, it burned a lot more oil, and it was knocking pretty good after that. So I made up my mind I was done with that engine. I started looking for another one, and I decided after that experience I did not want another small block. So after looking around, I found a Mark IV big block that I could afford, so I bought that, and that's what it has now. The big block was introduced during 1965, so it was available at the time this car was built. This engine was built in '67 and started out as either a 396 or a 402. It's been milled so many times the numbers are gone, and it's been rebored several times. I'm not sure what displacement it is now, but I put it together as a 325 horsepower 396 that was available at the time. The performance of this engine has kind of been the exact opposite of the last engine. It starts really easy, it idles down like a Swiss clock, even when it's cold. It has been really reliable, and best of all, it never overheats. In fact, without a thermostat in it, it never even warms up. With a thermostat, it just gets hot enough to open it up and that's it. I've driven this in 100-degree weather, I've climbed hills with it, been in standstill traffic, and it never even tries to run hot. So I'm very pleased with that. And here it is. And it doesn't look the best right now. There's a lot of temporary wiring and that hose is kinked. It needs some detailing, but there it is. The transmission is the Saginaw 4-speed that I told you about. These were available with a 4-speed, although back then they were made by Muncie, and yes, they're not the same thing, but they function about the same, and from here you can't really tell the difference. I already had it, and I also knew someone that had a brake and clutch pedal set for this car, so it seemed logical to use it. Also, at the time, I knew nothing about automatic transmissions, and buying a 50-year-old one in unknown condition didn't sound very good. It's pretty much been working all this time, but I do have a few complaints about it. The biggest one is the gear ratios. This has a 254-to-1 first gear, which, to me, is too high of a ratio to get the car moving from a dead stop. To get the car moving smoothly without stalling the engine, you do have to slip the clutch quite a bit, which on flat ground in the middle of nowhere, that's not really a problem, not even worth mentioning. But in the city, in standstill traffic, it's a problem. In places where you have to get the car moving, go walking speed for about 20 feet and stop and repeat, the clutch doesn't last very long, no matter what your driving technique is. The rear axle has 331 gears, which, according to the internet, is what a 4-speed car would have had originally. Now, I could fix the high first gear by re-gearing the rear axle down to like 370 or 410, something like that, but that's going to make high gear even lower, so on the highway, we'll have to rev the engine even higher, and it's going to use more fuel, and the engine's going to wear out faster, so I don't really want to do that. It also has a lot of backlash to it in every gear, and some people have told me that's normal. I have a hard time believing that, but this is the only one I've ever owned, so I really have no idea. It's not a problem accelerating or decelerating, but trying to maintain speed, it can get pretty clunky. And lately it's developed a new problem. It jams pretty often. It gets jammed in neutral, or it gets jammed in gear. If you line up the RPM, it does shift, so I think the synchronizers are worn out or something like that. But that's pretty much the big reason why I stopped driving this. It just got to be too much of a problem. If this car originally had a 4-speed manual, I'd probably be more interested in saving it, but it isn't. So my plan has pretty much been to unconvert it and get an automatic for it. I've been collecting a few parts for that. One big reason why I kind of don't want to do that is I won't be able to use this console. This is an original 4-speed console that I paid a small fortune for, and I have a hard time just removing it and paying a small fortune for another one. But whether I repair this transmission or replace it, I'm still going to have to roll this car out on the pavement and take it apart. And a car this size, no matter where I put it, it's going to be in the way. And I've had several big projects to worry about, so I just kind of lost interest in it and parked it. But a lot of those projects have now gotten under control, and I'm getting tired of this car sitting around, so I'm going to do something with it sooner or later. Anyway, that's enough talk for now. Let's take it out on the street and see what happens. Naturally, now that I have the camera rolling, the transmission is working perfectly. You might hear that clunking whenever I upshift. That's the backlash in the transmission. It's got that typical 60s car suspension to it, where you can roll right over a speed bump at any speed and not even know it. You really got to be careful taking off with this, because if you push the gas pedal down a little too far, it'll just take off and go, whether you're ready for it or not, because it is a big block, and it'll do that in any gear. There's a lot more I can talk about and show you with this car, but I gotta end the video somewhere. So probably talk more about it in future videos. As for my plans for this car, well, obviously the first thing I need to do is give it a good wash and detailing. The transmission, I'm going to have to either repair or replace that, and I'm probably going to do that pretty soon. The engine compartment is a mess that needs to be detailed. I want to replace the top, the wiring, the exhaust system, the radio, a bunch of other stuff. I kind of did an okay job putting it together when I did it the first time, but I could do better, so I'm probably going to take all that apart sometime soon. And there's a bunch of other stuff. And when I get around to all that, you'll see it in future videos. So anyway, that's it for now. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.